All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get going. Hope you're enjoying lunch. Nice little working lunch here in the Newcomb Hall Ballroom. Just a couple brief announcements. Again, I will have details at the end of the afternoon plenary about tomorrow's programming. But a couple notes for you today. In the adjacent room in the main lounge, the UVA press is still there. Please go in, check it out. You'll have some time after this session. There'll be two events going on, so you can mingle and stay on this floor. And joining them today is the Northeast Slavery Records Index. I really recommend you check out the project they have. It's really interesting, an incredible resource, a huge database of materials, and incredibly useful for tracing ancestry in the Northeast. So definitely stop by their table. After this session, we're going to ask that, right, you're done with lunch. You're going to stretch your legs. There'll be coffee here. There'll also be coffee and snacks just down the hall that way in the South Meeting Room. And we ask you all, please come down. We have 7 intrepid undergraduate presenters who are sharing. It's a combination of research, experiences, and projects that they've worked on related to the themes of our conference and the work we all do at our home institutions. So we'd really like you to come in, grab a snack, walk up and talk to the students, and talk with one another. Should be, I think, really rewarding, and then if you have time, float down here, and I think there'll be plenty of time to do both. And that'll all before we start the afternoon breakout panel sessions at, I believe, 2:15 or 2:30. Oh my gosh, I don't have it in front of me. Anyway, you have programs. So next, you're here. I am thrilled to introduce our plenary session. This is a conversation with Kenyatta Berry, professional genealogist, author, and contributor to the 1619 Project, and James French, chairman of the Montpelier Descendants Committee and the chairman of the Montpelier Foundation Board of Directors, whom you heard from briefly yesterday around this time, before we had to check a new box on our bingo card. And I'll have news about how we're going to finish that panel as well for you this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to Kenyatta and James. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So, James, as we get started, I want you to describe sort of your career outside of Montpelier, both in banking and technology.
Thank you. First, I want to say hello to everyone and thank you for coming back. I hope I had nothing to do with what happened yesterday, and it won't happen again today. But thank you for coming back. And I'm really sorry that yesterday's event was canceled because of what happened. The Descendants of Enslaved Communities organization here at the University of Virginia is doing some incredible work. And I understand that that seminar, the webinar, will be rescheduled very shortly. So it's keep an eye out for it, and please attend when it comes back. So, to your question. Indeed, I do have a life outside of Montpelier and outside the Montpelier Descendants Committee. I want to correct one thing that was said earlier. I'm not the current chair of the Montpelier Descendants Committee. That would be Larry Walker. I'm the founding chair, so the former chair, but I am the current chair of the Montpelier Foundation. In my other life, I'm also a graduate of the University of Virginia Business School, and I spent over half of my life in various places in Africa. I grew up in West Africa in the Ivory Coast. I lived in Senegal for several years, Algeria for several years, Gabon. I recently came back from spending and working about a decade in South Africa. I was very saddened to hear that Trevor Noah retired yesterday, or announced his retirement yesterday.
Oh.
And so throughout my life and work in Africa, I've been inspired by my father's example, who was a doctor and brought us there as a from his previous career as a surgeon to a new career as a public health physician. And I was inspired by kind of his vision and ability to innovate solutions to huge problems. And I gravitated towards a career in finance in Africa and then in emerging countries kind of writ large. And long story short, working several years for a very large global bank taught me a lot about how world economies worked, how they could work well and work very badly, and how they could be potentially a source for positive outcomes, economic outcomes, but how they often failed that and essentially had the potential and often did hurt economies and people who were poor to begin with. And so I was looking towards how I could take what I learned from as a treasurer and head of corporate finance for a large global bank in Africa and apply it to some of the problems that I saw affecting normal everyday people. So what I did was in taking that kind of large treasury experience that I had with the bank, I got involved in looking at very small one-on-one transactions between people who were not necessarily ever part of the banking system in various African countries. So we call that the unbanked. So how do you bank the unbanked? How do you bring them into an economy where they have a chance to participate and have access to credit or have access to the same types of opportunities, despite the fact that they may never have ever had a bank account before, they may be a vendor on a street, or they may be living in a village somewhere that is not really connected to the grid, but you know, they have one of these. And so how can you bring technology, how can you bring financial solutions into technologies that can be available to people? We call that fintech. And it's not just it's not just confined to a phone, but it opened up a whole new world of possibilities. And I've been concentrating as an entrepreneur in the last several years into how I can innovate some solutions to particular problems in finance to bring greater access to people.
So do you think that this background has helped you as far as your role at Montpelier on the board of directors, as well as kind of in crafting the new vision and mission statements?
Interesting question. I think I bring a solutions-oriented mindset to what I do, and I combine that with a deep family background and love for history. So being able to put those two things together, looking at kind of complex problems, you know, relating to narratives and to holes in historical research, but then looking at an institution and saying, you know, how can this institution that we have play a role that it's not playing today to fill some of those gaps? Right. And so I bring kind of I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think I do kind of have a solutions-oriented mindset, and that does affect how I look at what we're doing today.
And with your role and kind of where the, I guess, board is going since all of the stuff that has happened, one of the things that we did talk about was structural parity. So can you describe what that means to implement structural parity and how that relates to reconciliation?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't know if people have heard of the term structural parity before. Structural parity, we were going to get into this yesterday when we were talking about the rubric and the University of Virginia's Descendants of Enslaved Communities use of the rubric as kind of a guide for, just navigating relationships between the descendants of the university, of those who, 4,000 plus 4,000 plus known enslaved people who built and maintained and were responsible for the existence of this university, and their descendants today. And so the rubric is, if you will, a guidebook, not a book, but a guide for best practices in institutional relationships between a community of descendants and an institution such as this, or Montpelier, or a large, any other institution. So parity is one of the main concepts of the rubric. And so what parity means is, how can we deconstruct relationships that have been heretofore, in essence, opportunistic or exploitative, in the sense that an institution which has all of the decision-making power and can choose to address its deep past or not at its will, how can we avoid relationships of tokenism, where the institution kind of looks at it as, well, we need to check this box, and we can do it by hiring that person, or we can do it by, making a declaration about X issue, and then move on. So the notion of parity says, wait, well, there's probably a better way to do this. So let's look at the governance structure of the institution, and traditionally, who has a say at the table? Who can sit down? Who is invited? Who is allowed to make a decision? And simply put, in its simplest terms, parity says that in an institution such as a museum or even a university, the descendants of the community who built the institution and who were essentially lost to history, their identities were lost to history, their descendants still are around. They exist. They're part of this country. They always have been since day one. Well, they should have, parity has a meaning in the dictionary, right? Parity means equal. They should have at least an equal say in decision-making and authority, from the top board level all the way down to the volunteer level, in how the institution is run. Now, you can look at that as in a variety of ways. You can look at that as, oh my God, that's gonna flip everything, what do we do? Or you could look at it, as I do, as an affirmation of Madisonian principles, which are, people have a right to self-government. The sphere of representative democracy should include all of us, and that we should find whatever governance structure we can to, in essence, harness the democratic spirit that the Constitution itself speaks to. So I look at structural parity as really an expression of a Madisonian mindset and a Madisonian principle. And it's no wonder that the rubric itself was developed at Madison's home. And so, so was the Constitution, and centuries later, so was the rubric. And they both kind of express the same admiration of that democratic spirit, and they embrace it, and they, kind of challenge us to accept what it really means. Now, last thing I'll just say, or I know you want to get to some other things, but I think of it this way. So if you sit at a table, if you have a boardroom table, and there's a round table, and there's some folks at the table, and there are folks outside who've never been at that table, but they're asking to be seated as equals for the very first time in history. They want to be seated as equals. They don't want a tokenized relationship. They don't want an opportunistic relationship. They don't want to be invited in when that group in the room decides, okay, please come in and then please leave after an hour. If they come in and they're invited to sit down at the table as equals, I ask everyone here, did the people who were sitting at that table lose power? I don't think so. I think the people coming into the room brought with them their own power. And if they can enter into a dialogue, civil dialogue, because, after all, we all have a common heritage. We all want, whether it be an institution such as a university, whether it be an institution such as a museum, or whether it be the country itself, we all want it to succeed. So the people inside the room have a certain amount of legacy power, and the people who just were seated as equals bring their power. So what got more powerful was the institution itself. And that's kind of the notion of parity.
And have you found that it's been difficult to get people to understand that? Or, because I do feel like sometimes there is that sense of losing power, right? You're bringing in someone from the descendant community, you're bringing in someone who didn't have a voice before, and now there seems to be they feel threatened for some reason. How do you kind of combat that since you're a solutions-oriented person?
Well, so there are two sides to every coin, right? So there are people who have that response, and you can see it very frequently. But there are a lot of people who don't have that response. There are a lot of people who understand that power is not power, like history, like any concept, right, is not zero sum. It's not a pizza that you chop up into pieces and say, here, you have one. Now the pizza just got smaller. That's not how it works. So yes, there are people. You asked about people who feel threatened by that, and I look at it this way. I look at there being people who welcome. We're saying we just want to we want to bring more power to the table. We want to bring more legitimacy to the table. We want to bring more sustainability to the table. We want to improve the condition of this vessel that we all live in. Some people will get that, but others, I think, will eventually understand that. I look at those folks as allies in the making, not as opponents, not as people to be defeated or in any way vanquished, but brought along, because we are all in the same vessel. So it's not easy always. I mean, I think there are absolutely there are certain aspects of certain portions of the media who I think thrive from division. There are others who don't want unity. Perhaps they're threatened by that. But I'm not really worried about that. I think that people understand that there's a much larger issue at play, and that's how do we unify the nation? And you unify the nation by having people seated as equals. And I don't know of another way to do it.
And so with Montpelier and your descendant community, it's kind of very broad, I would say. For example, I've been to the exhibit at Montpelier, and in one of the enslaved cabins is a surname of Alexander. And that's one of the names in my family, although my family is Culpeper in Madison County, Virginia. And so technically, I would be considered part of the descendant community, although I can't definitely tie my ancestors to Montpelier. So describe kind of how you guys came up with such a broad definition of descendant community and why that's important.
So I'm going to read to you something. This is from the rubric. It's on, if you have it, it's page 1. You don't have to look in the index, the table of contents. So the rubric defines descendant community like this. It says, in its most fundamental form, sorry about that, apologize. Can you hear now? So in its most fundamental form, a descendant community is a group whose ancestors were enslaved at a particular site, but it can transcend that limited definition. A descendant community can include those whose ancestors were enslaved not only at a particular site, but also throughout the surrounding region, reflecting the fact that family ties often cross plantation boundaries. A descendant community can also welcome those who feel connected to the work the institution is doing, whether or not they know of a genealogical connection. Now, I think it's really important to reflect on what this is really saying. It's a short sentence with a deep meaning. What it means is that at Montpelier, for example, there is the Montpelier Family Cemetery. It's a powerful place. If you haven't been there, you should visit it. It's a place of great reflection to be in the presence of James and Dolly Madison. Very powerful. About 200 yards away is a little forest, and there's a field of periwinkle. And if you look closely, there are little depressions in that forest. If you go there in the winter, you'll see snow in the depressions. And in that forest, we have found through LiDAR surveys and ground detecting, penetrating radar, about 300 graves, unmarked graves, of people who we don't know who they are. We know that they were enslaved at Montpelier for over 300 people for over 140 years. So we don't know, I mean, we know about the history of the plantation, some of the sales of some, the sales of some people, some families, and the different periods that it existed, from Ambrose Madison on down to James. We know kind of the macro level, but there were not a lot of meticulous, records kept. So who are those people? Who are they related to? Who did they love? Where are their children? Where are their parents? Now, we could say, well, the descendant community is only the people within this boundary of this plantation, and that's it, end of story, next problem. Or we could reflect the fact that we just don't know. And what is the purpose of history if it's not to uncover the things that we don't know? So we're trying to find out the identities of people who were purposefully erased. Their identities were erased. And so that's why this is really, 57 of the nation's leading scholars got together, and they thought very hard about how should we define a descendant community. And that allows for that inquiry that we still have to engage in.
And I like that you have such a broad definition of the descendant community, because I felt very welcomed when I was there. But in preparation for this, we chatted, and you mentioned two things struck me, but one is you mentioned the invisible founders. And so what did you mean by that? Who are the invisible founders?
Well, so what I call the invisible founders are those very people that we just talked about, right? So we know of 300, this is a huge cemetery in Orange County. Now, in the Atlantic world, in the system of Atlantic world slavery, which we are part of, or were part of in our history, the largest known cemetery of enslaved people, the largest one that has been so far identified, is 600. It's in Barbados, which was a sugar colony where people just came and literally were worked to death, and usually by 5 years you died and someone else came and replaced you. Richest colony in the world for quite some time. Montpelier has half of that. What that means is that it's a major site of American history and African American history, and that there's a lot to uncover there. So what we want to do is to restore the identities of those people. And we feel that In so doing, we can make connections that are not currently visible, not currently apparent. And so going forward, that's really going to be part of a lot of the kind of the work and the excavation that needs to be done.
And then there's also, I believe you're doing a project at Montpelier to kind of memorialize these folks as well. Is that part of that project?
It is. We have a memorialization project that has just begun, and it's kind of the focus of it is to, the purpose of it is to begin some of the, there are lots of things that you can do, just, further excavation of kind of mapping of the cemetery, testing of grave shafts, testing of soil samples, and then eventually making the very difficult ethical decision about whether or not to touch human remains, what to do with human remains, how do you ethically make that decision, and then do you test remains for DNA and all of the various possibilities that presents. So that's part of the memorialization process. But then you have to memorialize people.
Right.
And we had a workshop in 2019 where we brought artists and scholars from around the world to Montpelier to discuss what are the best practices of memorialization. And memorialization is a really important part, but it's just a part of the model of the, I guess it's an aspect of one of the outcomes of parity. So what it means is that it's a conscious decision by the institution to uncover those identities that have been, kind of put away in the forest for centuries now.
Right. And then, so as part of the, one other thing you said that struck me, just as someone who does slave ancestral research and often looking at how when you do this research, you have to tie both the enslaved to the enslaver, right? So you're researching two families. And you mentioned that the Madison family existed in an African-American community. So can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So we know that historians have researched the people who live on the plantation, and we know that for every member of the Madison family, there were 28 enslaved people. So the Madison family enslaved 300 people for about 140 years, over several generations. And there were several generations of enslaved people. And they, all kind of lived right there. So if you're in a community in which your family is part of a community where other families are more numerous than yours by a factor of 28, you could posit that you live in their community.
Yeah.
Not the other way around.
Right, yeah.
I don't think that's very controversial.
Right.
We don't think of it that way, and that says a lot about us, how we kind of look at the past. But I'm sure that James Madison, growing up, was in constant contact with people who were African American in his plantation, in his father's plantation, then his plantation, and had a relationship with them, and was influenced by them, socially, culturally, even intellectually, and I can get into that. But this is to say, it points to a deeper point. The deeper point is that we have a common heritage. And that heritage is not often explored. Those lines between the white Madison family and the black enslaved people did not exist in real life. This was a community of people living together. It was not, a physical, I mean, there were fences and there were rules and there were things of that nature, but at the end of the day, it was an ecosystem that they all lived in with porous borders. And it was a community that existed like any other community with a culture, norms, its own common origin stories, its connections to outside communities which had similar demographics. So I think it is helpful to think of Madison, the Madison family, or the Barber family, or the Newman family, or all of these families that existed in similar conditions as being part of an African American community. And I wanted to say one other thing. So I mentioned 300 graves. That's the largest known cemetery in that region, but it's not the only cemetery. I mean, right next door at Bloomington, there are many, many graves. At 6 miles away at the Barber Plantation, there are likely to be hundreds of graves. My family has a family graveyard. These cemeteries are all over the region. And there's history there. There's history waiting to be understood and explored. And I know we'll get into a little bit into kind of what are the potential outcomes of exploring that history. But it's really fascinating that there is so much yet to know and to discover. Madison was, at the end of the day, more than anything else, Madison was a scholar. He believed in the power of knowledge. He welcomed, he and Dolly Madison had famous dinners, and they would invite people of all political perspectives, and they would start in the drawing room, and they would come into the dining room, and they would just talk all night long. And this process of discovering new facts that we don't know about, I'm quite sure Madison would support that and would look at this as the power of knowledge that a free people needs to govern itself. And that was something that Madison was deeply, deeply motivated by.
So then let's get into sort of, you mentioned intellectually the community influencing him. Talk a little bit more about that. And then also I want to get into sort of the other piece you touched at the top of the discussion around kind of, I won't say political camps, but how I guess, the narratives of history are used to trigger people and put them in different camps, and how we can really unify through our shared history and our shared heritage.
Well, thank you. I really do want to talk about that because the purpose of what we're doing is reconciliation and bringing people together. And I'll answer your first question first, but that's really what this, the intended outcome of parity is. You asked about the intellectual aspect of it. So I'll give you, we just opened in a new hike, a new trail in part of the property called the East Woods. And it is a huge portion of this 2,700 acre property that has laid undisturbed since the time of Madison. So there's a huge forest there now, but it wasn't a forest before, they were fields. And now you have this forest where you have 200-year-old trees that used to be tobacco fields. Tobacco is a very destructive crop. Essentially, you get 3 years and then you have to let the field lay fallow for about 20 before you can replant. And these are hilly kind of areas of the property. So what they were doing, this is kind of in the late 18 teens, right after the Napoleonic Wars had ended, the South, the Cotton Belt is just opening up. And so there are a lot of people being sold from Virginia down to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. So people were really worried about that. And the soil in the East Woods had been depleted by up and down plowing. So essentially, the topsoil, not only was it a destructive crop, but the topsoil have been running down these furrows into the bottomlands. And what we discovered there was that in the bottomlands, where all the good soil had gone down to, back in the Madison's time, that was underwater. That was a flood zone. So you had this dilemma. That's where the good soil was. I don't know if you've heard of the crisis of 1819. It was the first kind of, it's not Wall Street yet, but the first Wall Street crash, if you will, the first depression. So you have this huge economic depression. You have the opening up of the Cotton Belt. You have depleted soil, and you have the good soil at the bottom of the hill, but there's water on top of it. So what can you do? You can either move the water or you can move the soil if you want to plant there. What we found were highly sophisticated, hydrologically engineered canals in the bottomlands that move the water. So they run for like a quarter of a mile in parallel, and in between there were strips of tobacco. And so the enslaved people were able to innovate this solution to move the water, not the soil. And the best thinking on this, right, currently, is that, by the way, these canals still run clear to this day if you go into the forest, and we've just opened up a hike there. So the best thinking is that the engineering that was done was brought from Africa, where you will see contour plowing in places like Senegal, Burkina Faso, and along the western coast of Africa, and similar hydrological works. So it was a different type of plowing, a different type of hydrological, kind of engineering that was not used anywhere else on the property, and had not been used anywhere else that we know of yet. So why am I saying this? You said the intellectual.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
So we see, and we can only speculate, what were the motives of the people who did that, right? They're probably thinking, let's plant the tobacco.
Right.
Let's help earn money on the tobacco. The alternative is not so great. And they found a solution. And there's evidence of that today, and it's absolutely fascinating. We just opened that up. So that's an example of how a community, it's not just labor, it's not just culture, but knowledge flows in all directions. And we want to document that. We want to discover that.
And so just real quick, one of the things I think we talked about earlier, or we discussed earlier, is sort of how sometimes you don't find the work finds you, in a sense. And I think that's definitely your case, and that's definitely my case. But I think your background, just from that story you were telling, your background in Africa and all of that led you kind of to where you are today, in my opinion, just from having this conversation with you. Because those are things I wouldn't have even thought about or discovered or been able to even articulate in the way that you've done that. But I really want to get to the part about the narratives, because I feel like the narratives that we kind of hear from the enslaved or about the enslaved are so different. They aren't about the intellect. They're not about the knowledge. They're not about the work that they did to help kind of keep the plantation alive. It's more of a negative connotation. So talk to me about, or to us, about the narratives of history and sort of how those kind of divide us today and what we can do to bring that together.
Thank you for the question. So the reason why this is such important work is that what we literally are trying to do is to say there's a common heritage that we have, all of us in this room, all of us in this country. It's not an easy heritage. It's not an easy story. I mean, it's a difficult story. Get that. But we're all American. And we can all be inspired by, we're all part of the animating democratic spirit that is reflected in the Constitution. Now, I want to say something about, I said what parity is, I want to say something about what Montpelier is. So Montpelier is very unique. There's no place like it anywhere in the country because it is the place, the only place that I can think of in this country where you have these two completely opposed ideas occupying the same space. You have liberty, the document of the Constitution. James Madison in the second floor of his house studying 2,000 years of history, seeing what worked in all of these past empires and what didn't work and why didn't it work. He said something about a general assembly. He loved the idea of general assemblies, but he said, if you had a general assembly and every single person in that general assembly was Socrates, you were still at risk for mob rule. That's what Madison said. And he said, because people get excited, they get animated, they get emotional, and they don't always act logically. And that was one thing that Madison understood. So you have these two opposing kind of models of power occupying the same literal space, liberty and slavery. And our opportunity now is to understand how they functioned in the real world, how they negotiated with each other, and how it led to where we are today, how it creates a heritage. You know, Christy Coleman said the other day, a heritage is history that we can all agree upon, right? So how can we agree upon, as Americans, on the good stuff and the bad stuff? How do we come to that? You know what I mean? How do we agree upon a more complex heritage? And if we can do that, it's not about assigning guilt. None of us were alive then. None of us are responsible for anything that our ancestors did. That's ridiculous. But if we can agree upon a common heritage, could we not find ways to arrive at a common purpose? And embracing and reinforcing the ideals and the principles that Madison inscribed into the Constitution. I mean, the democratic ideals of the Constitution are world-changing, and they're absolutely the only reason why you and I are on the stage having this conversation. Because of the rights of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech. But it didn't come about easy. And we have to now reinforce those ideals with a more complete history. And I think that the potential of what we're doing at Montpelier, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not going to say it's a one-to-one solution, but there is a potential to make that heritage, that origin story, more inclusive and more suited for what we need to do into the future, which is to reinforce our democracy and to truly embrace it and to unite with a common purpose. And I think that that's something that Montpelier, unlike any other place, has a chance to contribute towards.
And so with that, I think we may have time for audience questions, but with that, I have one final kind of question to build on that. And for the folks that are here, given your experience at Montpelier and kind of the ups and downs and things you've seen, I know there may be a lot of folks who are doing kind of smaller projects, their institutions, or they're kind of like a grassroots type of thing, trying to research the enslaved, trying to get some reconciliation or some recognition. What advice can you give them as they kind of go through the process and maybe meet some resistance, but also give them some advice on opportunities to where they can possibly make a change at their institutions?
Patient, be determined, understand that there is a really good chance that when people who may be resisting what you're doing and not listening to you, when they do start listening to you, that they will become allies. And I think that that is a huge, huge potential, you have to always remember that the purpose here is reconciliation. You know, why are you doing this? You're doing this to improve our lot. You know, we're doing this to improve our country. And very few people, I think, honestly, if you ask, do you not want to improve our country? Very few people would, in their heart of hearts, say no. Now, so persistence, patience, grace, all of those things, they're very, very important. But also, descendant communities need to speak with each other. They need to collaborate. They need to find allies. One of our earliest supporters is the Wakasa Memorial Committee. And that is a committee that was put together by the descendants of those who were interned, the Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. And when they heard about us, they immediately contacted us and they said, guess what? We use the rubric and we're building a monument and we want to work with you. And so that's an example of kind of a coalition approach, coalition building. We're all into this together, you know. And so, you know, make yourself uncomfortable. Speak to people who don't agree with you politically. That's okay. That's absolutely okay. What a boring world this would be if everyone agreed with you. And so, you know, those are the kind of just two things, or a few things I can think of.
That's great. Thank you so much. I don't know if we have any audience questions by any chance. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You. I'm not asking so much about the complex history, which is a story unto itself, but in the arena of public history, you know, Montpelier has gotten a lot of press, and because there's sort of been this zigzag, you know, and without compromising anything, can you really speak to that last moment when the Descendants Committee, which you apparently were a great mover in founding, got lopped off and then brought back in? So could you speak to, you know, how that process happened?
How, so I understand your question. You're asking about.
You had a Descendants Committee, and that was exemplary. And then, you know, there was a tumultuous period of 2020, and we all were talking about how apparently you were sort of cut off by the board completely, and it was shocking, right? And now apparently you were brought back in. And I would like you to speak to that process, that bridge building process.
Okay, well, I mean, essentially what happened was that an agreement that was made with the Descendants Committee and the board was reversed in March. And we, you know, the details are that, and the agreement was that the Descendant Committee would elect its own representatives, you know, very Madisonian. That was the original agreement in June. And then that was kind of reversed, and we were then told, no, in fact, the last word would be with the board itself. So we, in essence, in effect, would not be able to elect our own representatives. So that's obviously not the same thing. And not very Madisonian, which we believe in, Madisonian principles. How did the process go from there? I mean, the public spoke up. That's what happened. I didn't do anything. The public spoke up. The public said this should not stand. And that is the power of kind of, 11,000 people signed a petition. I didn't start that petition. That was spontaneous. The Wakasa Memorial Committee that I just mentioned, I'd never heard of them. They put out a letter of support. And all of the major associations of museums, the very largest in the world, the American Association of Museums, Alliance of Museums, which is the largest accreditation body of museums in the world. They're the ones who give accreditation to all the household name museums that you know of. They called for that decision to be reversed and go back to the original agreement. So there was all of it. It was a rising tide of there was an outcry, and that's what happened. So we welcome that, and I think that's what I'm talking about here, is that people saw what could be lost if that table that I was talking to you about did not see people as equals. This is an important experiment, an important experiment in governance. And for it to work, you gotta be equal. And you gotta elect the people that you choose to elect. You can't have people chosen for you. So I think people realized, wait, we might lose this chance. That's really all I can say, because that's what happened.
Hi, the only exception I would make to a comment is that you made is that I think those of us that enslaved people have a threefold responsibility: to acknowledge it, to repent, and to repair. And so I would say that yes, ancestors, I feel like my mission is that threefold as a person who comes from a slaveholding family. So I do believe that there are families in America that need to take that process on.
Thank you. One of the things that you spoke of when you said the heritage narrative, you said none of us are responsible for what our ancestors did. That is ridiculous. I love it that you say that if everyone agreed with you, then it would be boring. So I think that statement in some ways to me sounds like coded language to make a certain population feel comfortable. I don't know who those people are, but some people are uncomfortable with the idea that they may be in any way responsible for the behavior of their ancestors. So that comment to me seems like it's kind of coded language that lets people off the hook. You're not responsible for what happened in the past. So as a result of that, I write the question, are we responsible for maintaining the institutions that our ancestors created? And so it seems to me that even the word descendant community in some ways maintains that hierarchy. Because in my mind, if there is a table and you invite me in or I'm allowed to come in, someone owns that table. I come into someone's home, I don't own the table. I get to sit there as long as I'm polite. But when I become impolite, then someone wants me to leave. And it seems to me that the word descendant means that those folks are being asked to come in and participate. How can one have parity when you don't own the table? When you are not an owner of the table, but merely a guest at the table? And so I don't know how these institutions are facilitating equal ownership when we are inviting people to be guests. That's just my take on it. So as an African American person, I think that we have to continue to build our own institutions, and people from Madison and Jefferson have to be guests at our table, not just us being guests at your table.
Okay. So thank you for your comments. I want to, can I respond? Yeah. So I wasn't invited to any table. I'm a descendant of enslaved people right there where Madison's plantation is to this day. No one invited me in. Matter of fact, the opposite happened. People tried to keep me out. The Descendants community of the Montpelier area got together and organized, founded a group called the Montpelier Descendants Committee, and we demanded seats at that table. So, and it was a very difficult struggle, extremely difficult. I don't know how closely you have been following the story, but we eventually prevailed. And the descendants of the enslaved people at Montpelier, their representatives who they chose are now the majority of that table. So I ask you, whose table is it? You tell me. I mean, you have strong feelings about it. We are in the majority at that table. And so I would ask you to consider that what we're doing actually is something new. Just consider it. Give us a chance. Because what did we do after we were asked not to leave the table? We persisted. We're still there. We are, in my estimation, the strongest board of any museum in the country. If you look at the list of our board members, they have, and this is the Montpelier Descendants and their representative, some of the leading luminaries of history, leading scientists, doctors, deans, descendants of people who were actually enslaved there, household name journalists who are committed to this work, people who have in the past moved mountains and came here to move more mountains. And they're acting all on behalf of the descendants of those who were enslaved there. And I think what we're doing, soon as we sat down at the table, what we did was we said, let's reconcile with people who may have disagreed with us. Let's see if we can have a common language. Everyone kind of doubted our right to be there but us. We never doubted that. And we still believe that we do have that right. But it's important to understand that we rejected the offer to be guests at that table. We did not accept that. And we're not guests at that table. And I hope that you will come and visit us in Montpelier and you will see just how. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. I think we are at time.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Kenyatta Berry and James French. Thanks for your questions. So again, we're moving from here to the South Meeting Room, which is out the doors to the right, down to the end of the hall. Grab a snack, grab some water and some coffee, give our students a chance to set up, and float down to that room. Thank you so much.